Hey, I'm Anali Jamal, and today I want to talk to you about my top 10 ways to get the most out of your practice routine with the guitar. And that's regardless of what style you're playing. Now, as you may know, people who plan their practice routine will not only learn faster, but you'll be able to develop those better skills that you can actually transfer into any other field that you're interested in. So let's have a look at these 10 tips and see if you can better your practice with them. All right, so tip number 2 is having no distractions. Make sure that when you're practicing that your attention and your focus is going 100% into that. The reason I say that is if you really want to maximize your practice routine, this is one of the most effective ways of doing that. So sometimes I would even practice for 30 minutes or 45 minutes a day, but really intense. I would really spend a lot of time on whatever my goal is during that practice session to get the most out of it. So in a way, it's almost like I'm hyper-focusing. And at that point, I kind of have my phone on airplane mode. I have all the notifications turned off on all devices, no TV. Put your phone in a cookie jar with a timer on it, even if you have to. And most importantly is be alone if possible. I say that because sometimes when we're practicing and we have someone else in the room, I think you know that feeling that it feels kind of like a performance. You almost feel like you almost have to play something that you already know to make sure that the other ears that are kind of listening in that same room can have a pleasant experience. Now I say that because it's so important to be vulnerable when you're practicing. When you're practicing, you want to make mistakes. You want to catch those mistakes and you want to fix those mistakes. So I find being in that space that you are really alone, you're more comfortable, always makes it a more enjoyable practice routine. I know that I used to live, with my parents and my brothers, and growing up, practicing was a pain. It really felt like I had to perform during my practice sessions where I just wanted to play that like 5-note run or something on the guitar. I wanted to play it 100 times. But I know that I'd be getting a big knock on the door saying to stop playing that. So that's why I say it's so important to be alone and be vulnerable when you're practicing. It really helps to get you in that mindset to make mistakes. Make mistakes more often than not, because that's how we're going to be able to grow as quickly as possible. That's a very important aspect and a philosophy that I try to approach in my own playing, and has really helped me to achieve a really solid practice routine. And the whole no distractions thing is true for anything that you want to learn. It's not just related to a practice routine. So as you can probably tell, a lot of the tips that I'll be going over are philosophies that you could actually use in any field. I just happened to use them in guitar very early on when I started to play the guitar. So I wanted to make sure that I had a really strong foundation to kind of build off of. All right, so tip number 3 is trying the Pomodoro technique, which is basically a method, a time management method that was developed in the 80s. And so the philosophy is quite simple. You work for a set number of minutes, usually 25 minutes, then take a few minutes break and then repeat. This is so important that if you are able to kind of tap into that 25-minute range, for example, with no sort of distractions or anything like that around you, it helps you to get into a more flow state. I'll be talking about the flow state a lot more in my future videos because I'm a big believer of that. And it basically is talking just more or less as keeping a stimulated growing experience or learning experience happening as you're playing or as you're learning anything. Because if it's too easy, it becomes too boring. And if it's too difficult, it becomes too stressful. So we want to find that right balance, that mix of those, and really make it stimulating enough for us to really be productive. And so the point of this technique is to reduce the internal and the external impact that you can have that might interfere with your concentration. And so with that, you can also take this a little bit further, and you can even go into a 90-minute cycle. So setting a timer for 90 minutes and working straight for 90 minutes on whatever task that you're working on, then taking a 10-15 minute break and then repeating if necessary. And so with that, I find that doing a 90-minute block is a lot more effective because this actually reflects a more natural concentration cycle that we go through. Of course, this is all dependent on your own time and how well you're able to manage everything to get to a good productive flow. And so if that is an issue, if time is an issue for you and you're not able to do a 90-minute block, perfectly fine. You can still do a 25-minute or 20-minute block. Work around your time periods or your work periods. So say, for example, that you have an hour lunch that you're going to be uninterrupted for. Maybe allocate 25 minutes during that lunch hour that is probably going to be more productive than you doing it at nighttime. Say that your partner's home or your kids are home and there's more distractions to be going around. So I'd really suggest for you to kind of find that block of time that you have that's really just for yourself, completely alone, no distractions, for you to kind of get into that flow state. And so I find using these times to define your focus can really excel your practice routine. And so again, this technique is something that I use not just for guitar playing, but I actually also use this for anything else that I'm doing. If I have any projects coming up, like working on a CD or working on a website, or working on an online course or something like that. This is a really great technique that you could use to your advantage to really get the most out of your time. And so for tip number 6 now, if you're playing scales or any sort of melodic playing, I'd suggest that you do that over a backing track. The reason I say that is because it's much more musical to apply these ideas over actual chords, not just to nothing. Because if you think about it, scales or scale notes, an ascending or descending line, it's not really that musical just by itself. So I find that you get a lot more musicality out of it when you actually play it over a backing track. It also forces you to think about certain notes that sound wrong over certain chords, or certain notes that sound good and right over certain chords. It forces you to kind of have this other sort of ear open that's not just a technical side, but also a more musical side as well. Now, one way to do this is to play subdivisions. This is by far my favorite way to practice scales and melodic playing. And so if you're not quite sure what a subdivision is in music, it's basically dividing a beat into a number of notes. And what I do is I switch between different sort of rhythmic ideas. So if the beat is going at about 120 beats per minute, I would play quarter notes first of the melodic run. Say it's a 6-note run or a 7-note run. And then you would play them after the quarter notes. You'd go directly into 8th notes, then into triplets, then into 16th notes, for example. And then you go backwards. And if you're not quite sure what I mean here, have a listen to this. Now I find this technique has helped me enormously to be a little bit more musical with my melodic playing. Whenever I'm improvising over chords and things like this, it allows me to quickly switch between 8th notes or triplets, right? And when you do that really seamlessly, it really becomes a musical experience for both you and the listener. It's also very good practice to get into this idea of shifting between different beats like that. It really forces you to have a little bit more of a musical perspective of approaching music. And so typically if I were to do some scales and stuff like that, I would do that for about 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes. Again, this is all depending on how much time you're allocating during your practice routine. Whew. All right, so that was 10 tips and tricks that I personally use that hopefully have helped you as well to determine whether or not you're going to be using these in your own practice routine. I think finding a good practice routine can take time, a lot of patience, and a lot of clear thought as far as what sort of guitar player you want to be. At the end, we're all trying to better ourselves and trying to get there as quickly as possible. But more importantly, we need to be very efficient with our time management to get to those goals. And with that, it's so important for us to manage our time well, for us to reach those goals realistically. All right, so with that, I'd love to hear from you if any of these tips and tricks helped you in your practice routine, or even if you've already started doing them, but maybe just haven't been able to verbalize it yet. I think that's a pretty cool thing too. Anyway, I'd love to hear from you in the comments to hear what you thought of this video and if it gave you any sort of value towards finding your best practice routine. And if you did enjoy this video, make sure you hit the subscribe and the like button below. It would really mean a lot to me and also help this channel grow. A big thank you to all the patrons at my Patreon site who actually voted on this topic for me to make this video. Without them, this video would never have existed. If you'd like to become a member yourself and join the community of like-minded guitar players, I do have that link down in the description below. Thanks so much for your time, I really appreciate that, and we'll see you in the next lesson.